Tonight, we've got a couple of things that we're going to do. So we're going to hope to finalize our community engagement plan. Dr. Sarah Warren will run us through kind of updates on that. And then we have two different scenarios to look at tonight. So the first one, we're going to be looking at a second iteration of a middle school scenario. And again, we're just starting kind of the middle school process. So we're in some iterations around that. And then the second scenario that we'll look at tonight is our kind of final iteration around our elementary schools, getting that to a draft to be able to take into the community. And just anybody that is watching at home, just a reminder that, you know, this work is constantly in progress, and none of the things that we're going to be presenting tonight or even to the community are final decisions. So, you know, we are not going to get to final recommendations until the fall. And then, you know, the board will have its own process around that. So just reminding folks that there's still tons of time for engagement and input, and just really wanting to make sure that we are doing justice to making sure that we're thinking through all scenarios and outcomes for the community. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to, actually, let me make sure everybody has the Miro link. I'll put that in the chat, but I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Warren for some updates on community engagement.
Great, thank you. So what we're envisioning right now is a first wave of engagement before the end of the school year, and then further engagement once we come back in the fall and as this process continues. So there's quite a bit going on over the next few weeks. And so we don't have the dates just yet. We're still looking, making sure that we don't set up a conflict with one of the other events that's expected. But late May, early June, we will plan to do one in-person public event where people can come and learn about and talk about this process and give feedback. One that would be in person and probably at King Middle School, and another one, again, in person at one of the schools on Stevens Ave. Maybe we've got the principal of Lincoln here, so maybe we can get a commitment to a space there. And then we will also do a virtual one. And then the other thing, which we haven't had a chance to talk with this group about yet, but we're hoping that maybe our committee members can help us in engaging our PTOs, at least at the schools where you all have connections. And I've done a sort of draft agenda for that meeting. If the committee members are, you know, game for doing that, we can share that draft agenda. And then, you know, if you have questions or want to talk it through further, we can do that offline. So 2 in person and 1 virtual led by the district, and then whatever we can get committee members to do in partnership with PTOs.
Awesome. And Sarah, can you say the timing of those again? I know you don't have exact timing, but the range that you share.
Yeah, I think it'll be at the sort of end of May and the beginning of June before we get to the end of school.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And was there anything else that you need from the committee at this point for that set of engagements? I know we did the sign-up sheet last time, and then we had also generated just content around the webpage, but just wanted to make sure there's nothing else you need from us in this committee.
I'm just pasting in the draft agenda here as a starting point for folks to think about what it would look like to meet with PTOs. Other than that, I don't have anything at the moment.
Beautiful. Awesome. Any questions from the committee? I think that, so once we get the dates finalized, we'll communicate those by email and can do some organization around those outside our meeting times. Beautiful. Don't worry about it, Ariel. People are coming when they can. I know it's a busy time of year. Awesome. So I think then it makes sense to turn it over to McKay now, unless Superintendent, if there's anything else that you wanted to add before we go to McKay. Okay, beautiful. So McKay, I'm going to turn it over to you now for our first scenario that we're going to review today for the middle schools.
Great. Well, thank you, and great to see everyone again. Happy May. It's sunny in Portland, Oregon here, so it's a very good day in Portland, Oregon. So wonderful to see you all. Wanted to start off on, I believe everyone received the materials for this concept on scenario 3, middle school scenario. This came about as looking at, as we were looking at 3 middle school feeder, which you currently have, looking at balancing those 3, we could get it to around low 60s to mid to high 60s in both of them, and trying to balance the socioeconomic pieces as well. We got that to around, the best that we could do is one was around 62, the other were 52. And so we wanted to look at, with the capacity that you all have, what that would potentially look like with a 2 middle school scenario. And again, this is just to share a concept and to get feedback. So we wanted to be cognizant. I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see that? Okay, great. We wanted to be cognizant of both capacity utilization at both schools, utilizing the new capacities that were prepared for us earlier this year. So both looking at capacities, utilization, the economically disadvantaged percentages at both schools if it were split schools, and then also looking at the currently, your feeders from elementary into middle school have quite a few slivers, meaning that there's these smaller communities of elementary school students that are split off from their K through 5 cohort and go to a different middle school. So if at all possible, it's always good to look at that from a perspective of minimizing those split communities, or if you have to split an elementary school to 2 different middle schools, to be cognizant of evening out those populations on both sides of those lines, so you don't have 10 fifth graders going to a whole new group of students that have been together essentially from K through 5. So in looking at that, what you're looking at here is the dark line here is the current middle school boundaries. And you can see they are a bit wonky, and that's mostly for, I believe, from transportation routes going down and being able to pick up students on both sides of the roads. So some of this is parcel driven. So that's why you have some wonky pieces. So the dark black line shows where this is currently Lincoln. This is currently King up through here, and then this is currently Moore. And so under this concept, you also have, and there's the school locations as well. Let me zoom out just a little bit. You also have in the yellow kind of hatched, dotted line here is the scenario 5 that we'll go through next for elementary school. And that is essentially to look at what the splits would potentially do in this scenario with 2 middle schools. And as it is now, we chose King and Moore as examples. And that was mainly because Moore and King have the highest capacities of all 3 middle schools. This would have all island schools still assigned to King as they currently are now. And this would split only currently it would split, sorry, let me get my Longfellow here in the yellow line here under elementary school scenario 5. And it would split Ocean Avenue here, which is currently, this is the outline for Ocean Avenue under scenario 5 elementary school scenario. So it would split communities here and here. However, Rowe would feed fully into King in this scenario, East End would feed fully into Moore in this scenario. And then these three schools, Talbot, Lycett, and Presumpscot, would all feed into Moore still. So, and Reiki would stay at King because of distance. So what this looks like under this scenario would be a 91%, 92% utilized at King, 91.3% utilized at Moore, looking at the current student population. And then if we look at concept under economically disadvantaged, you would have around 57% at King and 57% at Moore. And so it does a good job of balancing those pieces. It keeps splits to a minimum, with wholly feeding into elementary to middle school, quite a few schools, except for two. I'm going to turn back on the hatched areas. These would be areas that would be affected under this scenario. So again, all of Lincoln. And then if we look at how students would be affected, I'm going to bring over this. This is just the PDF of what we were looking at. There would be changes here in the East End feeder. Currently, East End is split between Moore and King. This would feed wholly all of East End into Moore. So there might be some distance here. That is a disadvantage. Another piece of this is that Longfellow, most of the population of Longfellow is to the south of the school. And so that's not quite a half and half split between both of the middle schools, but there's a good enough population to the north of the school so that it's not one single community being pulled out. And then quite a few students in here. This is a big one. This area here that is mostly in Talbot, right? Would be going to Moore instead of Lincoln, and then this area, the top of Rowe and the top of Longfellow, that currently go to Lincoln, would then be split mostly to King. So that is the scenario. I wanted to show you the statistics here, showing this is where you are currently with resident students. And just as a reminder, we're only looking at resident populations. So you have quite a bit of student transfers within your district. And so again, the most stable population is the resident population. And so that's what we're reviewing here. This is the current utilization of King, Lincoln, and Moore. Under this scenario, Lincoln would be consolidated into King and Moore, right at around 92, 91%. The economically disadvantaged percent would go down, would have a pretty large downward trend, 14.6% to 57%, and Moore would increase by 10% economically disadvantaged percentages. So sorry. This is kind of the priorities of this scenario, and this is the number of resident students that would be affected by this or reassigned under the scenario. And then this is a breakdown of where those students currently live and where they would be reassigned to. So you can see Lincoln would have the largest impact. There would be 209 students that currently are assigned to Lincoln that would be assigned to King. 154 currently assigned to Lincoln would be assigned to Moore. There would be that movement to the south where East End is, where students that currently live within King would be reassigned to Moore to keep that true feeder of East End going to Moore. And then there's a small piece here where there are 6 students living within Moore that would actually be reassigned to King. And that's right on the, I'd have to review exactly where that is. I think that might be a Longfellow piece. So that would be the breakdown. A good amount of students affected by that, but it would be essentially going from 3 middle schools down to 2. So wanted to share that and open it up to you all for questions and any kind of clarifications on the map or the statistics.
Yeah, go ahead, Ariel.
Sorry to jump right in. And also, I apologize because I missed the first few minutes. So if I am saying anything that was already covered, I apologize for that. And I have to confess that I didn't get the chance to review the materials in advance of the meeting. So I'm kind of like wrapping my brain around, we're looking at a scenario of eliminating a middle school. So I guess it feels important to say up front, and again, maybe it was said before I was here, that this feels, it just off the bat, it feels to me like an emotional conversation to engage in. I mean, we've got Aris here, who's the principal of the middle school that we're talking about getting rid of. And I think just, the human cost of the decisions here feels particularly high to me compared to what we were talking about before with the elementary schools. I guess I'm curious, this is probably more of a question for the district, but is what I assume the primary motivation here would be the cost savings, and is the benefit that the district would get from that significant enough that it's worth, dealing with all the impacts that are going to come from it? And are there other benefits that I'm not thinking of beyond the economic ones?
Yeah, I think that is a really great series of questions that you raised. And again, I think this is a good time to just to remind folks watching at home that none of this is a final decision, right? We are exploring options to really try to make sure that we're critically questioning all of our paths forward, right? And so, I initially also had that pretty big emotional shock about this is part of our community. What would this actually mean? And I would invite the superintendent to kind of talk about the cost savings in just a minute. But I think that three benefits that I really see from a potential model like this is, one, to more balance the economically disadvantaged numbers within our schools, to get them almost equal. That feels like a really big advantage to all of our students and staff and community. And I'm not sure we could get it that close if we kept with 3 schools. So I see that as a really big advantage to this potential model. And then, and I'm sure other people in this group also feel this, to eliminate some of the divisions that happen at the elementary schools when kids go to middle school. I've just heard from a lot of parents that is really hard when kids get broken up from their peer group and have to start again. And then, I had a third thought that has just now escaped me. So maybe I'll turn it over to superintendent, and then it will come back to me. And then Priscilla will come to you.
Yeah. So we haven't run cost analysis yet on what it would cost or what it would save. We did look at it from an aspect of when we were talking about staffing for this coming year and thinking about what the average class size is at the middle school and what their team structure looks like. And so our middle schools function on teams, where our teams are built around the idea that there's 4 cohorts of kids on a team. And because of enrollment, we're not actually able to do 4 cohorts on each in each team and 8 cohorts within a grade. And so there's likely some pretty significant savings. It's also the case that Portland's been really fortunate in the fact that its overall enrollment over the last 5 years has been relatively flat. It hasn't gone down. It hasn't gone up since COVID caused a little bit of a drop. And a lot of that's been buoyed by new students coming into the district, and specifically in our immigrant population. It's likely, based on forecasting that we have, that our population will go down a little bit over the next couple of years. And so while it shows at 91% now, right, using today's numbers, it likely would be down in the next 5 years. And so that's something we got to think about. And so we're coming at it and sharing this map from an aspect of getting the committee's feedback and input, and wondering if this exercise at the middle school level that we're doing now is worthwhile to also do at the elementary level. But we have not, to your question, Ariel, run the numbers to say this is what it would save. It felt premature before first having this conversation.
Thanks so much for that. And I just remembered my third thought, which was thinking about the transition of having CDS come to the district and having the district be responsible for that. And there are probably going to be space needs somewhere in the district for those services, thinking about what could be possible if one of our buildings was utilized for something else like CDS, or could we put all of our pre-K classes in one building and create some efficiencies there and increase capacity. These are not things that are happening, but these are things that I think are layers to this. Priscilla, what are you thinking?
So I guess I was very shocked when I heard about this scenario, and be honest, I was not expecting it. But now hearing what Sarah and Ryan are explaining makes sense a little bit in my mind of like splitting it. But now just coming from the perspective of someone that spent over a year at the middle schools, all the 3 middle schools, especially Lincoln and Moore, those school feels for me to be so full and at capacity that I cannot envision in closing one of the schools and putting the students in another school, and Aris is here in the meeting, and she can probably explain what I mean by that. It's just the feeling when I'm in those schools, it does feel full. It does feel at capacity. And that's just my feeling as a staff being there, and it may be different, but that's the feeling that I have. But I also have a question that I don't know if it's okay to throw it in there, but it's just something that I'm thinking, okay? Because I didn't think that closing a school was at all a scenario. But if we're talking about costs and reducing and looking for space, since the beginning of this committee, we have identified that one of the issues was with Longfellow, right? Wouldn't be the case of maybe trying to think about the closing of Longfellow instead of the middle school? Just something to throw it out there. I didn't want to throw these questions in this group. I had this question with me since the beginning, but I was holding to myself because I didn't think that this was an option. But just something that I'm thinking.
Thank you, Priscilla. I've captured those thoughts, and I just welcome all committee members. Like, if there are other thoughts that you've been holding on to, you can really bring those here. Because again, we're not making any decisions today. We're just trying to generate the best path forward. Rob, what are you thinking?
I guess I also have like a strong emotional reaction to the concept of closing one of the schools. But I guess I had more of a question related to where that 91 or 92% utilization rate fits into things. Maybe Kate can sort of contextualize that for us in terms of what other school districts have done and whether that would be maybe a risk down the road.
And I that's a really good question, because we are still starting I was just prepping the draft forecasts for this year, right? And that is one thing that we don't have in front of us, is growth, potential growth within the district. I will say that it is an important thing that I think you all know this, and the district leadership knows this, that again, this is just looking at preliminary concepts, but no decisions, especially without knowing what the forecast looks like, should be even looked at. And you all would have the opportunity to look at that when that forecast is created. I will say that, so that is a potential danger of, we're just looking at current students. We're not even looking at historic trends, and we're not forecasting out. I will say that populations have been pretty stable. You don't have a lot of, you don't have a large increase in birth rates. Birth rates are trending down. That's not you're not an outlier in that way. And usually with birth rates going down, you need a certain number of development to help stabilize that population. In this case, you are an outlier in what is stabilizing your population. And that's because you are taking in a lot of students, not from birth, but from different populations, asylum seekers. So you have this, you are propped up a bit. So I see to answer your question, I see your population as being fairly stable if things were to stay the same as they are now, because your birth rates are trending down. You don't have a ton of development going up. So the population question mark is what happens to those students, the mobility of those students coming into your district. At 91%, I will say that, and this is where capacity becomes a question. It becomes a choice. Your capacity is always looked at in several different ways. The capacity numbers that were arrived about, I can pass back to Ryan for more information on that. But usually with the middle schools and high schools, there is a buffer. There's usually, like, what we are generally looking at here in a capacity at other districts is 100% is actually looking at a buffer of 10 to 15%. So what you're looking at here is potentially 91% out of 85%. And that's just a buffer because there's so much flexible use of space in middle and high schools that isn't necessarily there in elementary schools, because you have so many different possibilities in programming. So it's a very good question. 91% feels okay. I tend to look at the 80 to 90 as a really good feel spot. 91 is not super concerning from a technical piece, comparatively speaking to other districts. There's a lot of districts that are filling their middle schools to 110%. So just for perspective, so I don't think 91% is super scary to me, but that is being said without having all the information in front of us right now. If we were to run these forecasts today and I were to find a huge spike, maybe it's a big third grade that's going to filter down, and in 3 years you're going to have an issue in more because there's just a huge cohort that's filtering through. We would know that with forecasts in front of us. I don't see that in the historic forecasts, but that's always a possibility because populations are changing. And for your population, it's modified year after year. So the trends can be a little wonky to make predictions off of. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you for that context.
Thank you. Marley.
Hi. Well, just looking at the map and like hearing everyone else's opinions, I also, I guess, was shocked when I saw that Lincoln wasn't included, because maybe Lincoln is larger in like space, but maybe not in students, as from what was said. But I'll say this, and I said it already, but as someone who went to Lyman Moore just a few years ago, it was a really packed school, and I can tell you that it felt like the utilization was pretty high, because it felt like it was almost overwhelmingly high at times. And I also feel like that if there was like a potential option to close one of the middle schools, and like whatever was best for Portland, of course, but if there was an option of closing one of the middle schools, then might as well close all of them and just open one middle school for the city of Portland, because I think that it is fair to have a middle school on two opposite sides of town, but I also think that it's an interesting commute for a lot of kids who live in East End to go all the way to Moore every day. And having friends who went to all three middle schools, there was some who lived in areas of like the Moore district but could have gone to Lincoln, and it just seems like there's a lot of crossing boundaries. And obviously what we're all like kind of collected here to do is to make those clearer. But I just don't really see how, if that did actually come into effect, I'm sure there's a lot more benefits to it than the ones that I can think of, but I think that would cause a lot of stir up. And I think that if there's a idea of making one whole high school for the whole city, then there might as well be one whole middle school. But even that, the utilization would have to be a huge school, because if all of these buildings are already at their full utilization, then having one big school probably would push it over 200%. But yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for all of that. All of those thoughts. And actually, I just wanted to amplify part of what you said, which is around the transportation. And I didn't know, Dr. Warren, if we have any kind of like insight into potential impacts on like what this would mean for transportation, and if there would be any effects at the elementary school level with our routes based on boundaries such as these for middle schools.
We haven't even begun to do that level of analysis yet. And it ties into the conversation we'll be having next year about just sort of re-examining our whole transportation approach. Right now for middle schoolers, if they live anywhere within 2 miles of the school, they have to walk to school unless they're in a hazard zone, but we don't have a lot of those for middle school. And so, if that stayed, if the 2 mile rule stayed, which I personally will say I think is quite a long way to walk for a middle schooler, especially a younger one. But if that were to stay, that would be sort of how we would have to figure this out. So undoubtedly, it would mean that there were some more students that needed to be bused, but I don't know how many. That there's also a conversation, that's come up a few times in board meetings and in other conversations around transportation, whether we want to look at having middle schoolers go on Metro. And that would completely change this whole conversation if we were to entertain that idea. But that's something we haven't even had a chance to really explore and discuss with the community yet either.
Thanks, Dr. Warren. That's super helpful. Marley, is your hand up again, or did it not go down? It's up again? Okay, go for it.
Sorry, just a quick thought, but if I know Sarah just mentioned something about middle schoolers potentially taking the Metro. I feel like this conversation has come up before, and I might have said something then, but if that were the case, then there'd probably need to be a lot more buses because of how crowded they already are in the morning. It's already pretty not comfortable, and especially because the route that I take, I'm coming from North Deering and I'm going to Deering. So we pass Casco. So a lot of students from North Deering or who have been on the bus since East End are going to Casco, and then like more people come on. Like it's already really crowded during student and like school hours. So I think if that were to happen, I think it's understandable that there would probably need to be something really major figured out.
Thank you. That is super helpful. Damon.
Yeah. So, I think it's good to look at this scenario, at least to consider the pros and cons. And I think that it's worth noting that there's the scope of the boundaries committee to look at what can work within, the geographic boundaries and, what looks like it could work on a spreadsheet. might have impacts beyond that, and we really have to get the full depth of those from public input, and then the board, of course, would have to really consider closing a school. That's a huge deal. But I mean, I think as far as if it did happen, if we had to decide between, say, the elementary or middle, I do think that the middle scenario is probably has lower impacts. That's my take. I'd love to hear more input though on that, but I think closing Longfellow would have a lot of other impacts on sort of the neighborhood cohesion and walkability that would have a bigger effect on the younger students, whereas middle schoolers have more ability to travel farther distances with lower impacts. So, and I think for that reason too, it makes more sense to have two middle schools than one, because the older students, the high schoolers, if we do eventually go that direction, probably have more capacity to travel to longer distances overall. But I think that we really have to weigh those factors and think about walkability and transportation in a big way here. It is good to see that there is a better balance and utilization can work, at least on paper. But yeah, I really think we need more input on this and to think about some of these qualitative factors beyond the numbers.
Thanks so much for that, Damon. And I'm just thinking about kind of like what is it that we take to the community to get feedback on. And I think that we had kind of been talking about potentially having like a single draft to then socialize, but I wonder, and McKay and district staff push back if this does not feel like the right move, but I wonder if there is a version where we could bring two possibilities at both the elementary and middle school level, that one version would have an elimination of a school and one version would keep schools as is, and that we could get feedback on both of those varieties, because I think it's like, it is such like a big conversation that needs to have so much input and socialization and just like understanding. And I just wonder if that would be a possibility as we think about what we're bringing to the community.
I'm happy to support whatever decisions that you make. I do think it is to a couple of folks' points. If knowing how people are feeling about this. So if the middle schools feel full, there might be, getting that from the community might say like, I don't even understand how you could even fit this many students into two. Having lower capacity at the elementary school, I haven't heard how that feels, right? And so there's a definite aspect to understanding what community is feeling on the ground. There might be another group that says, no, we have plenty of space in middle school, or there might be folks in elementary that say we're busting at the seams. So I think it really depends on getting that why from your community, and if the feel is there, and then it's presented also the benefits or costs to closing or remaining open are also presented. I think those are good things to get feedback from the community.
Sarah, just to build off of McKay's piece, I think if we put two scenarios up, one that proposes closing a school and one that proposes not closing a school, it's probably the false comparison, right? That there's a separate question about whether or not we should consider consolidating a school at either level and what the cost benefit is. And so if that's something on the table, I think we should look at it, but we should look at it as its own decision. And then we should look at it from what does the boundary look like in that case. The reason I say that is otherwise, I think on those two comparisons, the general sense, especially in a feedback group where people are going to react viscerally to it, is always going to be to keep the school. And that may be the right answer, but that's always going to have more weight, I think.
Boyd, go ahead.
Just because the cost comparison piece has come up several times, I just had a question around, would that also include deferred maintenance issues? Because as one of the leaders of a school, and actually my school's going to be one of the older, Talbot's going to be older, but of the renewed schools, the maintenance piece is a big piece that the more buildings we have, the more deferred maintenance there is. And, we keep hearing about that across the district. So that's just a piece I want people to factor in, that I don't think necessarily, like looking at staff and shifts and things. It's maintaining the buildings, keeping, like, our playground's supposed to be, I think we're on the capital improvement program in like 2 or 3 years, but our playground's in pretty rough shape already. And so that's just another piece that it may not, I'm just curious if it would be part of that projection. And if not, I think people need to recognize that piece of it, as far as it includes a lot of parts of it, of things that go into the building other than just the staffing. Thanks.
And Boyd, I think that's an excellent point. I would add one other piece. Sarah mentioned this before, but one thing that could be discussed is, what is the building used for?
Yeah.
Right? Whether it's used, and I'm like, this is not thought out at all, but whether it's used as a pre-K center or an early childhood center or something else.
Yes.
It's a full-size backgammon court for students after school, like whatever it is. I think that would also be part of the discussion.
Yeah. Thank you.
What other thoughts or questions do people have? Yeah, Damon, go ahead.
So I guess I'll share something that I wasn't necessarily sure it was in the scope before, but then I don't want to just kind of break things wide open, but there has been discussion in the past of maybe having some different breakdowns in the grade groupings, pre-K through 2, and then 3 through 5, or maybe it's pre-K through 2, 3 through 6. There's a junior high academy. Like, it seems like maybe we need 2.5 middle schools. Like, I don't know, going to 2, I know the utilization works, but maybe it's tight and maybe it doesn't account for the flexibility we need. So I'm just wondering, just for instance, maybe there's some different outside the box thinking that could be done too, that could be part of the conversation. And I'm not saying that's what we should do. I'm just saying that maybe there is some consideration of that, to give so we're not as much fitting a square peg in a round hole, or trying to, where we have to think in integers. We can't have 2.5 schools, but maybe there are other things that we can make adjustments to, if it makes sense, and if that's what's best for balancing things, and if it is able to provide a better experience, a better quality, school district. So I just wanted to throw that out there, and you can tell me that's a terrible idea and I will not be offended. But I just wanted to get that idea out there.
Thanks, Damon. And I think it is a totally welcome thought, because I think it's important for us to entertain options. I do know in 2019 when the district looked at potentially redoing the grade levels at the elementary schools, there wasn't much support within it, and it wasn't a huge cost savings. But I think maybe the goals of that move were different than the goals that we have in front of us now. So I think it is, helpful to put that back into the conversation. Aris, go ahead.
I feel like I need to talk because I'm the principal at Lincoln, so I'm going to talk. But first and foremost, I want to name that I'm a big proponent of like looking at multiple scenarios, right? It really invites a lot of thinking and just problem solving. And I know that, obviously, closing or just reusing Lincoln Middle School in a different way would bring a lot of emotions to folks. And at the end of the day, we really need to do what's best for our kids. And we can't talk about like boundaries without talking about how we program for kids too, right? So that's important to consider and to know that, you know, in the potential consolidation into 2 middle schools, you are actually probably inviting a few more resources than we currently have, right? Because at the moment, you know, it is, we do have to figure out how we're going to resource for our kids and in the 3 of our schools right now, given our enrollment, especially at Lincoln. I also want to just like, you know, I really agree with what Marley was talking about, like busing and how it feels for the students is like really important to me. And so I think it's going to be super important to just be in those schools and just see how it feels to everyone, right? Because at the end of the day, I really don't want our students to feel like, you know, they're not being heard in one way, shape, or form. And with what Damon was saying, like, I mean, this invites other ideas too. Like, you know, have we ever talked about K-8s, right? That's a potential. And so that's what I'm trying to say is like, it's really difficult to just simply have a conversation about boundaries without talking about how we want to program for kids. And that's something we need to keep in mind.
Beautiful. I really appreciate all of those thoughts for sure. And I apologize for you feeling pressured to speak, but I think that your words were really helpful for the committee. Marley, what are you thinking?
Okay, this is my last thing, but going off of Principal Ayala, I also agree that it would raise a lot of stir up and backlash in the community because if you look at, for example, the recent event of the Bulldog logo on Fitzpatrick Field, a lot of people in the community felt rather emotionally attached to it and had some sentimental value to it. And others just were like, it's a logo on a field. And if something like that can raise that much of like a talk, then I guess like the talk of removing a middle school would kind of just go a little extreme to some people. But to other, like, I think it's good to look at options. And I think it like there's obviously benefits and like cons, but I do just think that the community wouldn't handle something like that all too well, if I'm being completely honest.
Yeah, no, Marley, I think that honesty is super important. I think that's the really great thing about our district is that people care really deeply about their students and their schools and this community, right? So I think the other theme that I'm just hearing come up here again and again is that we have to do what's best for students, right? And so whatever we determine that to be, I think that in some cases we may disappoint people, but for the overall district, I think as long as we keep that in the center of our lens, that we can move forward with integrity as long as we are intentional and thoughtful. So just hear everything that everybody is saying here.
And
yeah.
Sarah, do you mind if I just leave it? Because the grade reconfiguration is a very interesting one. And I have 2 kids, one is in 6-8, one is in K-8. And so it is and I see benefits of both. I will say that I've worked with districts on grade reconfiguration, and there does tend to be less disruption to community when grade reconfiguration is put in play because it's affecting all students similarly. It's not a geographic area that's having to move or whatnot. And so just thinking from that perspective, California has mostly K6, 7, 8s, and could that be a potential? I would like you all to know that we can look at that since we have breakdowns by school, by grade. We have residence-based information. So if that's something that you would be interested in looking at, we can definitely get you something.
Beautiful. So I think that it might make sense at this point, given the information on the table and the conversation that we've just had, to think about, like, given this conversation, what are the things that we would like to know more about or to have information about? So it could be in the form of a scenario, or if there's other information we just feel like we need as a committee, let's just try to name as much of that as we can. So Ariel, if you have a response to that prompt, or if you have another thought, feel free to share it.
Thank you. I'm actually just feeling, I don't know, a little nervous, like wanting us to set ourselves up for success, because I'm totally down to throw everything at the wall. I mean, presumably the district isn't going to be doing something like this again for, I don't know, a decade. I'm just throwing that out there. So I'd love to get it right and think outside the box and all of that. And I know that we are feeling some sense of pressure to do our community engagement and outreach before the end of the school year. And so if we're talking about both going back to the drawing board and looking at totally splitting up schools in different grade configurations than we currently have, and wanting to be having community meetings like towards the end of this month, something's got to give. I feel like I think feels to me like this work has gone at a relatively slow pace so far, which is fine, but it doesn't quite add up to me how we're going to be able to do those things in the time frame.
Yeah, I'm feeling that that tension point as well. Let me get Rob's thoughts, and maybe we'll circle back to some of this. Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
I guess I'm relatively comfortable. I don't know if we're sort of backtracking a little bit on the elementary school stuff that we've already come up with. But I'm relatively comfortable with where that currently is. And I'm a little hesitant to sort of start redoing that and maybe rushing that process when we've already spent so much time focusing on the map that we've already come up with. But with respect to the middle schools, I guess if we're considering school closures, I'd almost want to do some like preemptive community outreach first before we consider that, if that makes sense. Just because I think there will be a lot of backlash. I actually was at the Longfellow PTO last night. They invited me to talk about the boundary stuff, and I sort of teased the idea, and people were obviously a little bit concerned. So I would just like to see some outreach before we sort of really go forward with something like this. That's all.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Rob. What other thoughts or questions do people have? Yeah, Dr. Warren, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, just, I do think it's important that we get clear about what it is that we're taking to, if we're engaging people between now and the end of the school year, what we're engaging them on, and that we do it in a way that feels respectful to folks so that if we are going to entertain a bigger conversation around possible, reconfiguring of grades, rethinking programming, which I personally think is actually, those are great conversations to have. But I just want to be careful that if we are going down that path, we are totally open and transparent with folks about that, and that we're not sort of setting up one conversation in May and then people feel like they're getting hit with something totally different in September.
Yes. I hear all of those things as well. Damon put a note in the chat to ask for improved utilization in ED scores. Look at the pre-K, kind of like those different permutations. So I've added that onto the Miro board. And I think that that is something we could certainly do for the next meeting. Damon, go ahead with your question.
I wrote it down because I wasn't sure I would be able to say it as clearly as I could write that. But I feel like we got the elementary boundaries kind of as good as we can get them with all of the push-pull across the 5 different areas of consideration without changing some other variable. And I guess it didn't really occur to me before that the grade groupings would be a variable we could change. But if we can get some benefit out of that, I think we should at least be considering it. And I do think if we're going to consider that, we might want to rethink our outreach. But if we're not going to, then I think the outreach plan is fine, and that is what we should do. The other thing we could think about is having a two-phased approach where we make some modest changes now and then really start those conversations, and then maybe in a few years or something, after some more study is done, come back. And I don't know what the urgency is, I guess, too. Like, maybe this is something we need to do sooner. Maybe there's some real benefits to doing it now, or maybe there's some more benefits to waiting too and see where some of the trends go, and get some real input about it. So I really could see it going either way, but we are a little bit at a crossroads here, I suppose, at least as far as our outreach goes and our immediate plans for that.
Thanks, Damon. That was really helpful. Lauren, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I think it was similar to Damon's second point of, I agree with like him and Robin or what folks have said about the elementary school kind of seemingly like working within the bounds of what we thought, what we envisioned. But I do kind of see like, yeah, like it does feel rushed with middle school. And I wonder too, if there is again, like a two-phase approach with like, bringing to the community the elementary piece and then like continuing to work on an iteration of the middle school piece that might just be presented to the school board at a separate time. Because I also think even as like a resident and like taxpayer, I don't have kids that are in the middle school yet, but I think like as a resident, I also would love to know, kind of similar how like right when we change zoning codes and all of these things, there's a lot of planning and a lot of time and a lot of information and stats and money and financials and maintenance and building things that we're talking about here with we're switching to just 2 schools for middle school. And I feel like I would want to have kind of all of that information as like the larger why, to make an informed decision as a boundary committee person, even of like, what is the benefit of doing it from a programmatic perspective, from a financial piece. And I feel like that takes a lot of time and a lot of community engagement, that in this time frame we just don't have with this particular scenario.
Thank you. I think all of those are great points, and I hear some themes that are starting to come out. So I'm putting a pin in those. But Annie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of echo what Damon was saying about exploring the reconfiguration of the grades. Like, I totally agree with Ariel and Rob's point that like we have been doing this for a while, and I don't see how that fits into the timeline. But also looking at the latest scenario for elementary schools, I feel like we haven't. I guess some of my initial reactions were, just as a Reiki parent, thinking like, wow, this doesn't really change very much on the ground for Reiki. And so to what end was all this effort worth? And so I think, perhaps it is worth, reopening the diamond again, despite what that might mean for timelines, because what is the point of doing all this if we're not going to try to get to maximize the scenario for people?
Thanks, Annie. Superintendent?
Yeah, I'm curious if McKay can speak to her experience about districts who do it in like a sequential process or in separate processes versus all at once. Right? Because it does feel like at some level our elementary schools sit at least a little bit off from our middle schools. But I mean, you've obviously done this with a lot of districts. And so curious what the learnings are about doing all at once versus in a staggered approach.
Yeah, I think that there's mixed pieces in this. What I do know is that everyone hopes for making one move and then not doing it again for another decade. And I will say that that is unfortunately what we see because it's so hard to do it. You want to do it once. That's why redistricting only happens every 10 years because it's a massive brouhaha, right? So I would say that even in my own district, I find that if folks are warmer to understanding that this is almost a maintenance of your district, that population shift, residents, population shift, age groups shift, and saying it's a one and done is not, I don't think, a super realistic. I would hope that would be the way, but it's just not the way that it happens, especially when you have a built environment where populations are changing for one reason or another. So I see, in my eyes, a better approach if you have time. And what I do see on your side is time. I'm working with a lot of districts that don't have the time. They are either completely over capacity or they have a massive budgetary crisis and super underutilized schools. One or the other means we got to do something now. I don't see that necessarily with your district. And so in your district, I do think you have time to slowly bring this on board with community, look at potential other options. And what I said in the chat there was that boundary changes are a comparative measure. You can say, this is what you are at now, this is what it would look like. They are a comparative nature already under an assumption that we're looking at residence-based. When we talk about policy, that's a whole nother mechanism, a lever that districts can pull to look at balancing their enrollment or their SES percentages. But boundaries is a comparative nature to it, whereas grade reconfigurations or program movement have more of a paradigm where we don't know what it feels like for 6th through 8th to stay with K through 5. We don't know what it feels like to move this program from this location to another location. And so that tends to affect community differently and slower because it's more same effects throughout the district. But I do see that you have time and it's something that other districts don't have. And so from that perspective, a phased approach seems completely reasonable to me. And it seems like you would potentially be setting yourself up for better successes if you did take it on a phased approach. And that is looking at your boundaries, potential grade reconfigurations, and your programmatic pieces. So there's the policy thing is something that we haven't really talked about because we're talking about in absolutes as resident students. But that is a very real aspect. A lot of districts create their own problems because they keep letting students in that don't live there, that sort of thing, or vice versa.
So as I've been sitting here and kind of listening, I'm curious what the appetite would be for, instead of like delivering a product to the community in late May, that the sessions, the three in-person, the 2 in-person, the 1 virtual, and the PTO meetings become informational meetings about the process so far and the things that we've considered, and is an ask of the community, not necessarily about specific scenarios. They could see all the scenarios, we could explain to them, but it would be more of like a call to what else should be considered or not considered, and that it would be just, more conversational and informative. And then in the fall, when we were planning to do the second round of engagement, that would be more specifics on a set of scenarios that we would then bring to the community. Because I appreciate the 2-tiered approach, but I also think that it feels to me, and again, folks, push back if this doesn't resonate with you, but that the elementary plan is so linked to the middle school plan that it might be hard to separate into 2 phases, and that if we pull levers on one, it may impact the other. And so I think I would be more in favor of presenting a package to the community, but that it sounds like we're considering a 2-phase plan because it feels like we need more time because we just got to a complicated place. And I think we need to honor that complicatedness that we are hitting by giving it some more time. So I would look to the committee. Does that shift seem okay to like focus this community outreach in this late May and early June as education and engagement, and then in the fall do a packaged kind of direct feedback sessions.
Can I ask a clarifying question? So when you say package, do you mean if we're, say, looking at different grade configurations, that's part of the overall package?
Yeah.
Yeah. And thinking this through too, maybe, you know, there's 8 elementary schools. Maybe that makes it easier in some ways because just to divide it into 2 groupings of grading, you know, pre-K through 2, 3 through 5, it kind of makes sense. I guess I'd be interested to see a scenario that just does that. And maybe that's what we share with the public. Here's what it could look like. Should we, and we ask, should we look into this more? How do we feel about this? And just show within the box that we had put ourselves in, this is as far as we could take it. But if we get outside of the box a little bit and think about maybe doing some, you know, grade configuration changes, we can balance things better. I think we can. I'd love to see the numbers before I assume too much, but it does look like it gives us a little bit more options there. And so yeah, maybe that is it. It's just we take a little bit longer rather than having 2 phases. I could see that also kind of working out. Or we give the reaction is, whoa, no way. And then we go with the kind of the scenario 5 with the elementary schools and whatever middle school scenario with the 3 schools down matches that the best. And we say, yep, we did our due diligence, we looked into it, and this is the best way to go.
Thanks, Damon. Rob?
I guess I'm just wondering, I think we looked at something similar to reconfiguring schools maybe in 2018-ish. And I guess I'm trying to remember, I don't remember, but I'm wondering where we landed that time and why we landed there. It feels a little bit to me like we're trying to accomplish more right now, but it's possible we've already asked some of these questions in the past and arrived at answers. So I guess I'd like to dive more into that past experience as well.
Yeah, Rob, and I can give you a kind of like top level response, but then I think we can do a little bit more digging to see if there's anything that was missed. So I think that the district for a number of years now has realized that we have an income issue in that we have to find substantial ways for cost savings at some point soon. And, I think we've made some progress on that, but I think consolidating the elementary schools into grade clusters was an attempt at that in the past to find efficiencies and cost savings in a way that is big enough to make a real impact in our budget. I think what we learned from that, and again, I was not on the board at this time, so this is just what I've surmised, but that the community was not in favor of that, and it at the end of the day, the cost savings was not what people had hoped it would be. And I think what is interesting to me, though, is the issue on the table right now is not cost savings. The issue at the table right now is to balance utilization and economically disadvantaged statuses. So I'm not sure that lens was used at all in the previous iteration of the work. So I think that it's kind of a new, I think it's a new lens to that. So it could be worth seeing, like if we could, just to go back to Annie's point, like if Reiki isn't going to move that much, like is there another permutation that we could be looking at that would actually help Reiki move in the ways that we would like to see that? But I think your question is right, Rob, and maybe with a little bit of digging, we can get clarity about like, does this make sense to look at again or not?
Sorry, I just wanted to say that I have asked around people what the reaction was to that proposal in 2019 or so, and the perception that I got was that the conversation didn't really get off the ground because, one, COVID, and two, a lot of schools had recently been redone, and so I think people are a little taxed by that.
Thank you. That's more context. And there, I think that there was also just a ton of community disapproval in the idea of losing a community school, which I think we've talked about a lot within this committee as well. Lauren.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree, Sarah, with like the trend of kind of how we're thinking of it as like a package deal. I think one thing that would be interesting now that, we're kind of throwing more things as options is kind of like we need to potentially look at like our guiding principles when doing that and like redoing what our guiding principles are, because right, if we're talking neighborhood schools and we're like only getting 2 schools out of middle school, that completely changes kind of what a neighborhood school is. So I think, right, either we have like different principles for elementary and middle, or like, right, like some combination that kind of touches on all of the things that we initially said, a long time ago. So that was one comment I wanted to make. And then the other, I think, is just, I think with the community outreach piece, I think like I've learned so much just like knowing kind of what from the programmatic side of things, like what's involved in each of the schools, that I think, right, unless you have a kid that's there, and sometimes even with people who started their kids during COVID and like didn't have tours or didn't see, like learn a lot about each of the differences in the schools, I think that would be beneficial just to the community to kind of just like hear from, as McKay said, like the policy, the people, and like the students, like all of those different components, so that people can feel like this group is making an informed decision with their feedback, plus, what's happening, what's happening behind the curtain, so to speak, like in schools.
Awesome. I do want to move us to the last elementary scenario, just so we can see if we can get that to kind of final. But I just really appreciate people hanging in this gray space. Like, I know that it can be hard when we think we have a plan and then that plan has to change, but I just really appreciate the integrity and thoughtfulness that folks are bringing to this conversation. So McKay, I'm going to turn it over to you to do the elementary scenario, and then hopefully we can wrap up after that.
Yep, that sounds great. And from the programmatic perspective, I just wanted to bring everyone back to this matrix. And if this hasn't been shared with you, this is the 2024 student matrix. This matrix and then this piece is really, really helpful for just informing community, because this is where your students live, and this is where they live, and this is where they go to school. So this is where kids are being sourced from, and this is where they're going out to. And so when you look at this as kind of summarization of that, how many students are coming in or going out or coming in from outside your district. These are really helpful when we're talking about, because we are focused on residence-based. So I just wanted to bring that back up as a good tool as you're talking to community to bring up as a really important piece. The scenario 5, I'll go through fairly quickly, and we can kind of do a comparative piece. But essentially, we did look at further into areas around here and areas down here, going to Longfellow or Rowe, and both of those did not make a ton of sense from a transportation perspective. Either students were on buses for a very long time, or it wasn't moving the needle in any direction, in any meaningful way that your goals are to be. So this actually rolls back some changes from the Deering scenario 4, which did do a better job, to your point, Annie, of helping out Reiki. This did the best job. However, it came up that these 3 blocks were questionable because they are so walkable to Reiki. And so these 3 were rolled back these 3 blocks study areas were then pushed back to Reiki. And that's why you don't see as much of a change, right? That needle at Reiki is not, you're not affecting as many students, but you're also not moving the needle as much as if those 3 blocks were pretty crucial to that scenario 4. The other thing that was rolled back was this area here, up here was changed from Lyseth, or in that scenario, assigned from Lyseth to Presumpscot. That did not make a lot of sense from a walkability perspective from our last meeting, and so those were rolled back. So now this is where we are with essentially a scenario 5. Not a lot of change, a lot less students affected, but a lot less needle movage, just because we moved back some of those places that we originally moved and reassigned. And so this is what we are looking at. One thing to pop out here is that Presumpscot is at 213 students, which is fairly small. I'm going to bring this over so we can look at the statistics in a bigger way. And we really didn't. Why that popped out wasn't necessarily because we moved a ton of students out of Presumpscot. We were trying to bring students down from Lyseth to help out Lyseth, but that walkability pushed those students back up to Lyseth. So this doesn't change a lot with Presumpscot, but it's a small population that lives there, and a small population. We'd have to look at the attendance matrix to make sure we knew how many students attend there, because again, we're talking about residence based. So these are the changes from current to the scenario 5. The major jump is at Longfellow, going from the least utilized and the smallest residence population, or one of the smallest residence population besides Presumpscot, to 76%, so a 19% jump. It also increases the economically disadvantaged percentage by about 6 points in that direction. It also, the big changes here are Ocean Ave, and this is mainly from Ocean Ave and Longfellow taking on so many students. Longfellow from Ocean Ave, so that Ocean Ave can take on more students from East End. Ocean Ave does not dip down except for one area to take students from Reiki, reassigned from Reiki to Ocean Ave. But it is one of the larger changes in economically disadvantaged, increasing that from 37.5 to 46.4. When we look at number of students affected, not as many affected, mostly the 66 students living in Ocean Avenue that would be reassigned to Longfellow. And then another large one would be 28 currently assigned to East End would be assigned to Ocean Ave. And then here, a couple with 20 from Reiki going to Ocean Ave and 15 going from Talbot to Longfellow. That's that Deering triangle. And a smaller impact of 4 students going from Lyseth to Presumpscot. And so questions or comments about this scenario? Again, rolled back some of those changes from scenario 4. And most of that, you can see most of that change is in this area here. A tiny change here, and not much change right in here.
Thanks so much, McKay. Annie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so thanks, McKay, for such a comprehensive explanation. And also, I'm sorry, I keep complaining that things don't move on Reiki, but then I tell you oh, you got to put these people back at Reiki. But I was wondering, I thought that last session we had talked about it moving that kind of St. John's corridor from Reiki to Roe, because those kids are primarily bused anyways to Reiki. And I didn't see that reflected, so I was just curious if I missed a step as to why that change wasn't made.
No, that's a really good question. And that I kind of made note of that, talking to district leadership and talking through transportation difficulties that didn't seem to make a lot of sense. And so talking with district leadership, we rolled that back to stay at Reiki. It also there's a small needle move, but not, I think the decision matrix there was not enough to potentially put those kids on a bus for the length of time, and maybe leadership can kind of lean in on that, but that was why that was rolled back.
Thanks, McKay. Ariel, go ahead.
I think that this looks, as others have said, pretty good given the constraints that we're working with, and I appreciate the tweaking and all the back and forth that McKay has done to get us through 5 scenarios of this. And I think if we're not making any like structural changes, this is probably more or less where it makes the most sense to end up. I guess I'm curious because I really hadn't had in my mind up till this point in the process, and that's probably a shortcoming on my point, but I hadn't been really thinking about eliminating schools, and I think it is maybe a more fraught thing in elementary school and middle school, perhaps. But I guess I'm curious, the utilization percentages, either that we're at now or that this scenario gets us to. I guess I'm curious what, maybe from McKay's perspective, typical utilization percentages are from elementary schools, because I'm wondering if we could be in okay shape with one fewer elementary school than we currently have, or if that's not even worth looking at. I don't feel super attached to it, and I may be freaking people out by suggesting it, but I just thought I'd throw it out there.
It's a really good question. It's a very hard question. It is, how do you best serve all students? 200 kids in a school is fairly low. When you get down to the 60s or 50s, then that's when alarm bells tend to start going off on board members' ears of like, this doesn't seem sustainable just from the deferred maintenance alone. It is slightly different when you have Title I schools as opposed to not, because a less utilized school needs more resources, and so that can also be just an aspect to think of. And again, we're just looking at resident space, so we're not even talking about the policy piece. But I would say that alarm bells, we usually, when other districts ask me to kind of put these, green, yellow, reds, the reds come on above 95% and below 70%. That's when I generally see, and that can change district to district, but generally speaking, there's quite a bit of alarm in how low some of these schools are utilized and how small the populations of residents that are there that could fairly easily be pushed into a next door school with, you would have to weigh out that cost benefit.
Half our schools are under that 70% mark that you mentioned.
Yeah. And that's what, usually when I see a district, I'll go, oh, there's the challenge, there's the problem statement. And that kind of hit closer is the first kind of like, yikes. But it depends on your district and your board and your leadership and you all and community. There's a lot that goes into that because, again, we're talking about residents. We're not even talking about enrollment or programming, which is a whole nother ball of wax. But yes, generally speaking, these are low utilizations when I'm comparing to other districts.
Thanks, McKay. Priscilla, and Damon has a good note in the chat if people want to read that. Priscilla, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'm with just thinking about Annie's comment on Reiki. Not as a parent perspective again, but as a staff, I feel I like scenario 5, but I feel that scenario 5 is not addressing as much the issue of Reiki, that reducing that capacity. So that's why between 5 and 4, I'm leaning more towards 4, because that I feel that 4 addressed a little bit more of the Reiki situation. And I honestly do not see a huge change in between 4 and 5 in all the other schools.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that, Priscilla. Does anybody else have thoughts around kind of 4 versus 5, or if 5 feels good to folks? Yeah, Rob, go ahead.
5 feels good to me. But I guess when I was chatting with the PTO last night at Longfellow, there was, I guess, a little bit of concern. I mean, one, about their current enrollment numbers, which are low. I think they're concerned about losing students, but they're also a little bit leery about a rapid increase in the population. I think it adds about 1/3 of the current number of students to the school. So there's a little bit of worry about, I guess, making it work, I guess, all in 1 year, if that makes sense. I guess that's something that can be talked about down the road, but maybe finding ways to accommodate that and giving them the resources they need to actually make that happen would make sense. That's all.
Yeah, no, Rob, I think that's a great point. And I think like information like that, I think will be that information that we can gain at this first series of community engagement sessions, where we're informing and asking for, things people want us to consider. So I'm glad you did that pilot for us, Rob. I got to
experience it.
Annie. Yeah. Annie.
I like Priscilla's point about scenario 4, and I know I'm the one who came with the feedback from the community that we didn't want to split up Parkside, but I think it's worth having the conversation, because otherwise I think the Reiki community is going to look at this and say, this doesn't do much for us. So at least we can present them with the option of like, do we want to break up a neighborhood for the larger benefit of redistributing students more equitably?
Thanks, Annie. I think I might also be leaning towards scenario 4, just because in scenario 5, Prism's got the numbers. Like, I think that we might be just like recreating another Longfellow, and I just don't think that maybe sets us up for the most success. So I think I'm vacillating between the two. Does anybody else have thoughts? And I know we're just a couple minutes over time here. But any other last thoughts? So here's what I'm thinking about for next steps. So I would like to get together with Dr. Warren and superintendent, other district leadership, to think about like creating what we want to put in an engagement session for the community. So what information goes out to the community about the process, and the pieces of information we want input on now. I also want to work with them to determine, like, of all the different kinds of scenarios that were named tonight, like clustering grades, closing schools, like from their perspective, what are the most what make the most sense, or maybe don't make the most sense, but just like feel logical and something from their perspective should be investigated. And then we can communicate that out to the committee about what are the scenarios that we're going to look at our May 29th meeting. So those are the two next big steps that I'm taking. And then we'll be communicating the session dates by email, or the outreach sessions by email. Yes, Priscilla, I think we should, that is noted. Dr. Warren, around the community engagement, are we going to have a separate multilingual, or will we have interpretation at all the sessions?
We'll talk with, I think Grace is actually on here too, and may have
Oh, there's
Yeah, thoughts on that. Typically, we do a separate session, but because we're not doing very many, maybe in this case, we'll just provide interpreting. I think we'll have to figure that out. Grace, do you have an immediate reaction to that?
I think we should probably add it to the one that we're doing about the cell phone. We can do it at the same time, I think.
Okay.
Otherwise, it will be difficult to get another meeting because the numbers of days and availability of people are closing down on us. So yeah, that would be what I would suggest.
Grace, I agree with the idea of doing it with the cell phone. That makes sense, except the only piece I would add is because these conversations are so community based, and we're talking about from a PTO end, about having it at PTOs as well, that we should figure out how to provide capacity for those meetings so that we're making sure that they're able to have the conversation in that community as much as possible too.
I think what we can do on that one is to have an RSVP. So if there are parents who sign up for those meetings, then we will be able to find an interpreter for them. Otherwise, we will be staffing for nothing.
Yep, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful. So those are the next steps. Is there anything that hasn't been named in terms of the next step that people were expecting?
Sorry, I might have missed this part, but we don't have dates for our community engagement sessions that we're doing later this month, right? So
correct. They're coming ASAP.
Watching our email to be helping publicize those things as soon as they come out.
Yes.
Well,
go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, yes. And if we're going to have committee members sort of leading together with PTOs at your respective schools, that you're tied to, the other thing we're going to need to do is just make sure we've got clarity around when those are going to happen, and ideally connected to existing PTO meeting schedules, but that may not always be possible. So I think we'll have to figure out how we're going to move that piece of this as well. It is, Grace just alluded to this. This is happening in parallel with a pretty major push around community engagement for cell phones, and the conversation the board is having around a potential ban on cell phones during the school day. So we just want to make sure we're sort of respecting both of these processes and engaging the people who want to be engaged. And in some cases, there may be overlap, and in other cases, it may not be so much. So.
Okay. Yes. So short answer is watch your email. There'll be more information, I think, coming by email in between these meetings than usual. Okay, so I think we're gonna, the tough thing is with summer, it's harder to get engagement because people just check out and are on vacation or, traveling or whatever it is. So I think if we can try to get it in, and, if we have to schedule something else, we can think about what that would look like in the fall. But I think for now, let's try to do what we can do this May and June. Okay, well, just thank you all so much. I think we made some big moves tonight and really had some great conversation, and just appreciate all of you for showing up and being so thoughtful. So we will see you again on May 29th, but also just keep an eye on your email. And as always, reach out with questions. And if you do, if you get invited to a PTO or a community group or something, and you want resources or more information, just reach out to us and we can help fortify you so you have what you need going into those spaces. But we will talk to you soon. Take good care.